Hello and welcome back to episode 2 of Resilient State. Following on from our discussion last week with Dr. Louise Tumchuix and Eliza Glantz, both of whom talked to us about how security was changing to require multi-domain responses, this week we're going to be looking at how defence actually works as a market, as we start to look at how we can build a better response to our national security needs. Now, I introduced myself last week, but to any new listeners, I'm Honey Louise. I'm an undergraduate student here in London, studying politics and international relations. I've spoken on nuclear issues at RUSI, so the Royal United Services Institute, and I've written on Gen Z recruitment rates for the Aerospace magazine. And I, of course, host this podcast. Now, to get us back on track, defence markets and an episode on economics might sound a little off-putting for anyone who hasn't studied economics before, and it might actually still sound off-putting to those who have studied economics before. But with the World Economic Forum, or as it's more commonly known Davos, taking place this week in Switzerland, it felt like a good moment to get to grips with defence economics. Our ability to buy and procure weapon systems at a non-eye-watering cost and within a realistic timeframe is central to resilience. We need to make sure that when we want something, we have a market capable of delivering that thing to us. And more than that, I'm sure you all are, or one day will be, taxpayers. That means more than just risking your security, it's also a risk for your money when there are major faults with our defence markets. So, to begin unpacking defence economics, we're delighted to be joined by Professor Keith Hartley, one of the UK's leading, and as you'll later hear, one of the very few, defence economists. Professor Hartley is an emeritus professor of economics at York University. He is the former editor of Defence and Peace Economics, co-editor of the Handbook for Defence Economics, and author of The Case for Markets in Defence. This episode is going to begin by looking at the current state of the UK's defence economy, what isn't working, and why these problems keep recurring. And from there, we'll move forward to explore what Professor Hartley sees as realistic options for reform and where genuine solutions might lie. So, Professor Hartley, thank you for being here today. And before we get into procurement failures or reform, it's worth, I think, stepping back and asking a more basic question, which is, what is it that you do? I think we've all heard of economists, but defence economists is a less common term. So what's the specific job description for a defence economist?
Okay, right. I'm a defence economist. There aren't many of us around, certainly very few in the UK. But effectively, what we study is the economics of war and peace. If you like, and put it another way, defence economists study a whole set of things. So I'm interested in, for example, procurement, the buying of major weapon systems. I'm interested in single source contracts, which are monopoly type contracts, where there's a great problem in trying to get some competition into the contract, where you've only got one single supplier. And how do you set up a contract in that situation? I also have experience of what are called Augustine weapon systems, and we might come to that later on in the session. But these are very costly weapon systems. They're so costly that perhaps in my wildest dreams, wars might become unaffordable, which would be a good thing. So those are the sorts of things I'm interested in, which constitute and represent defence economics.
So we can safely say you know your stuff then. My first question for our listeners and for me to help set the stage is that this episode is happening now, yes, to coincide with Davos as we mentioned, but because we also know that the UK defence market doesn't work, and it's often termed a market failure. So briefly, what does that term mean? When we say market failure, why doesn't the defence market, the buying and the selling of weapon systems, why won't it work like other markets in the first place?
Yeah, it means that markets are not working properly. And when they're not working properly, that is a case for the state to intervene. It doesn't mean to say that the state must always intervene, but it's a case where some form of state intervention is required to improve the operation of markets and make them work better.
And by better, we're talking about the efficient allocation of scarce resources.
Yes. In welfare economics terms, it's a situation where perhaps you aim to get what's called an optimum. We never get that in real life, but in our models, in our dreams, we have what's called an optimum, the best allocation of resources. So in principle, if markets fail, the state intervenes to try to get to the best allocation of resources. And there are two types of imperfections broadly. I mean, there are more, but broadly, where you have monopolies and cartels, they stop markets working properly. There are externalities, which we might talk about, where some of the impacts of actions by individuals go beyond the individual. They affect a larger community, either with beneficial externalities or harmful externalities. So that is the argument for governments to intervene to try to get markets to work properly.
Okay, so I studied economics in school, and I learned one reason for market failure was a good being a public good. And I wondered if, as you've said, a market failure is when resources aren't handed out efficiently, and essentially they're not going where they're needed or where there's a demand for them. So why is defence being a public good being a cause for this failure? Why aren't we having resources be allocated as it's needed?
Right, okay. So defence is it's a different sort of good. We've got private goods and public goods, and defence is a public good. So how does it differ from a private good? Well, let's take a private good as a motor car. I buy a motor car, and I'm buying it as a rival to you. Other people want to buy it. So it becomes rivalrous. There's some rivalry in that buying process. And also, when I've bought it, I can stop you using it. I have property rights in the motor car, and because I have property rights, I can exclude you from using it. And that is the contrast with public goods. With public goods, you have non-rivalry and you have non-excludability. Let's take a case of the air defence of York. York is a city. There's an air defence, a fighter aircraft protecting York. Now, I consume the air defence of York, and it doesn't stop other people consuming it. You can consume it. You have as much as you want. My consumption of the air defence of York doesn't have any impact on your consumption of the air defence of York. And also, it's another feature is I can't exclude you. Once the air defence of York is provided, it's provided for all of us. All the citizens of York benefit, and I can't exclude them. So what does that mean for defence? It means it's not like the motor car, which I gave you as an example a few minutes ago, where I can express my preferences for motor cars. I can't really express my preferences for defence. Those preferences I have every incentive to conceal. I have every incentive to free ride. Let other people pay for defence. If they provide it, great. I don't have to. So I can free ride on their willingness to pay for defence. And so that creates a problem in trying to work out how society, how much valuation we place on defence and protection and security. And a good example of free riding is the current debate between America and Europe within NATO. The Americans say, the Europeans are free riding on the American defence effort. And he's right, they are. For years, we've been free riding on the American defence effort, which is why Trump, at the moment, is trying to get the Europeans to spend more on defence so that the Americans can spend less. Let the Europeans defend themselves. So one of the problems with defence is this sort of public good means it's difficult to express your preferences for how much you want of defence as a society, and it has incentives to free ride. Why should I spend on defence? I can free ride on someone else's defence efforts and defence spending.
Okay, so because I get the same benefit as someone else, but I don't have to pay for it, I have no reason to hand over my money, essentially. Firm couldn't make money from me. Great, thank you. So building on that, as you mentioned earlier, we have one big buyer of weapon systems here in the UK, and that's the government. Perhaps maybe split our understanding into buyers and sellers. On the buyer side, on the government side, what's going wrong, which is making this absolute mess of the defence markets?
Well, do you want to start with procurement?
I think we would be very happy if we started with procurement.
Yes. Yeah. Typically in defence, we buy some very expensive, high technology projects, which are state of the art. We buy highly complex fighter aircraft, highly complex warships, highly complex aircraft carriers, and highly complex tanks. Things are not simple. So the first point I make about procurement is an achievement that, in fact, modern expensive weapons are actually delivered at all. it's quite an achievement to provide Eurofighter Typhoons, to provide aircraft carriers, to provide tanks and submarines. These are highly complex, very difficult pieces of kit. And they're not just there. It's not like building a motor car. It takes time and it requires a lot of skills, highly skilled labour to build modern, complex weapon systems. And I've talked about Augustine weapon systems in passing. Now, Augustine weapon systems, I think, a new class of weapon. They are very, very costly. They are very high technology weapons, and the costs are increasing over time, probably by a factor of 4 every 10 years. So these are horrendously expensive systems. And I expect we've got a problem at the moment in that we've got, on the one hand, expensive, complex Augustine weapon systems like the F-35, like Eurofighter Typhoons. And these are complex, but we also have very simple and very cheap drones. So, and it's coming through in Ukraine, and it came through in the Israeli conflict just recently, these cheap drones are now dominating the battlefield. There is a question as to whether or not eventually the armed forces will want to get ever more complex drones, and they'll make the drones so much more complex that they'll become almost as expensive as modern aircraft and modern weapon systems. And they'll become Augustine weapon systems in themselves. But for the moment, drones are cheap and they're revolutionizing warfare. It's not just not just the military. Police use them. The police, for example, if they want to explore a difficult land site, they can use drones to see who's hiding in particular buildings or what might lie around the corner. So that's cheap drones have revolutionized warfare.
So if we have this big problem in procurement of, we want fancy kit, we want high-end kit, and that creates these really expensive projects, what's happening internally that's really stopping people from saying, hey, what are we doing? Why are we blowing all of this money? Why are we blowing this taxpayer money on these pieces of kit and equipment?
The armed forces, admirals, air marshals, generals, they want the latest piece of kit. And the temptation is to add to the specification, to add more to it. And so what starts off as a very simple system becomes highly complex. And that's the way, I'm afraid, that the system is set up such that there's every incentive for the armed forces to demand the latest piece of kit, because they feel if they don't get the latest piece of kit, they won't get it. There's a problem in that the military, normally there's an Army, Navy and Air Force bidding for the defence budget. So they're operating in a very small numbers situation. We've only got one Army, one Navy, one Air Force. And they have no incentive to be critical of each other's major weapon systems. The Air Force doesn't have an incentive to be critical of the Navy's aircraft carriers. The Navy doesn't have an incentive to be critical of the Air Force's modern Eurofighter combat aircraft, and so on. So there's a system of collusion, of Buggins' turn. This year, the Army has its tanks. Next year, the Air Force will get its aircraft, and then after that, the Navy gets its aircraft carrier. That becomes difficult to provide competitive information to the Secretary of State for Defence. If the Secretary of State for Defence relies upon the Army, Navy and Air Force to give competing advice, he's not getting it. There's every incentive to collude rather than to compete when they're bidding for major projects. Now, we come to Ajax. There is a major problem, I think, which might be a feature of the British procurement system, a reluctance to cancel. It might be that we're so far down the track in buying Ajax and that the Army will fear if it cancels Ajax, it won't get a replacement, or it won't get a replacement certainly in any reasonable timescale. So the problem we're faced with now, do we actually cancel Ajax? I mean, it's a project which has been a long time coming. It doesn't seem to work in that it causes the soldiers to have earache and they can't ride the damn things, which is not a good thing for what's a mobile tank, really. They feel sick when they operate it. So I think we're going to have to face the possibility that we might have to cancel that program. It will be a massive cancellation, and the Army will not like it because it will do its best to make do and mend with an Ajax and see if it can get it to operate and people are not being sick all the time. But the alternative might well be that if you want a decent piece of kit for the army, we're going to have to cancel it and start again. But the problem with starting again is that the army won't get its kit in time. Now, at the moment, there's not an immediate war, so it can delay the introduction of a new piece of kit. But it does have that dilemma, and we have it as a country, that we are very reluctant to cancel major defence equipment projects. The last example I can give you where this went on horrendously was a Nimrod maritime patrol aircraft. That was way over budget, it was way delayed, and it didn't work. So the government eventually cancelled it. It was a coalition government under David Cameron that cancelled it, and eventually it got a replacement bought off the shelf from America, the Poseidon anti-submarine aircraft, which works. It works, is now in service. So there was a gap. The Air Force didn't have a maritime patrol aircraft for some time, but it now has one. It works, and it's working quite well. So I think we have this problem of trying to reach a decision about cancelling a major project, and we're not very good at that.
Okay, so coming back to people here, which you mentioned at the start of your answer just now, what's driving them to collude this way? As you said, there's the desire to get your kit, and that's one issue. But why is it that the kit they want always seems to be these really big, expensive bits of kit? Because surely they also need more day-to-day kit, they need to keep stocks up, they need to keep stores full. As we here at Resilient State think, we would very much like them to have the desire to keep stocks and to keep supplies of kit and equipment for when needed.
I think one of the problems we've got there are the incentives facing the armed forces. And it comes back to some of the issue we raised with the procurement. The armed forces like modern kit. They like the latest tank and the latest aircraft and the latest warships. There's no glamour in stocks, in having factories available for producing ammunition but not using it. And ammunition's not glamorous, whereas a modern fighter aircraft like an F-35 is glamorous. So your admirals and your air chiefs, they want the modern kit, the latest kit. There's no glamour, no prestige, no career enhancement in stocks, in ammunition factories that are perhaps empty most of the time, or only now are they starting to be used. So I think you've got a problem of the incentives that face individuals in the armed forces, and those set of incentives are the same sort of incentives that you have in private industry. The incentive to go out and make money.
Okay, so if they've got this incentive to collude, what's the incentive or perhaps the mechanism to not collude? So, people are drawn one way, they're drawn to not collude, but what's our counterweight? What's our system which we could look at or bolster to help tackle that incentive and reduce it happening?
Two things. The problem of trust is one that's built up over time. You need to get trust in your civil servants, in your Army, Navy and Air Force, in terms of giving you good advice about what to do. And that takes time, perhaps longer than the period of time that a government can be in power, longer than 5 years. You've got to actually understand how reliable some of your politicians might be, or your generals might be, and the military. So there's a problem of trust. It revealed itself in, for example, military alliances like NATO. You can work out principles of NATO specializing by comparative advantage and saying, right, okay, the Turks have a large army, let them provide the army for NATO. The Brits are good at nuclear weapons, let them provide nuclear weapons. The Germans are good at tanks, let them provide tanks. But the problem you've got is you have to trust that your allies will turn up. So come a conflict, you can't have a situation where the Germans don't turn up with their tanks. You need the tanks, they've got to turn up. And similarly, the Turks have got to turn up with their army. So there's a problem of trust within an alliance. I think it's a problem we've got at the moment with NATO. It's not at all certain that America can be trustworthy about turning up in the event of a major conflict involving Europe, as we're seeing laid out, I think, with the American policy towards Ukraine. And then the second principle which comes to mind is that really a principle of substitution. Quite often there are alternative ways of providing defence and protection and security So, for example, drones could replace Augustinian weapon systems. Not perfect substitutes, but partial substitutes. Women could replace men in the armed forces. Nuclear weapons replace conventional forces. Aircraft can replace anti-submarine forces. Or we could have drones, very cheap drones, providing maritime patrol sort of roles rather than expensive maritime patrol aircraft. So there's a principle of substitution, which I think the armed forces could take on board. And there's a lot of scope for doing that and taking that on board.
Finally, we've just spent our time now looking at what's going wrong in UK procurement and why it's going wrong. So before we move on to some of the changes you'd like to see made, I'm aware that we've jumped right in with the government and the military and what happens within those institutions. So if we just take ourselves out of them for a moment, are there any issues in how defence economics is explained to us, explained to the listeners, explained to the public that affects defence economics itself? I'm thinking of the traditional debate over welfare versus defence spending, which is a very old and very lively debate, and the sense that we want to have our cake and eat it, that perhaps some of the ways that defence is talked about and the public budget is talked about, that we've perhaps lost our understanding that the spending budget is finite. We often hear about spending and borrowing, and then we're going to spend more because we've borrowed more, so money sort of never seems to run out. But it makes sense from looking at it from a sort of an economics perspective, which we are, that if we increase one thing, we have to cut another. So if we were to perhaps be keeping this restricted view of state finances, could we use that to create the mindset where we always are thinking that money is limited and money is finite, as it is, and then we create the public support or the public demand to see high levels of ruthlessness with the efficiency of spending, and we apply that public pressure, that public norm, onto the defence sector?
The traditional guns v butter case.
Yes, the traditional guns versus butter question.
Yeah. Defence is not costless. It involves some costs and quite often very high opportunity costs. Opportunity costs are looking at the alternative use of resources. So we could spend on Trident and we sacrifice schools and hospitals by doing so. And the value of Trident reflects the quantity of schools and hospitals which we have to sacrifice. One of the problems is that voters don't understand opportunity costs. And that's not the voters' fault, it's the politicians' fault. Politicians do not explain the consequences and the implications of more defence spending. If you spend more on defence, you've less to spend on other things. So something has to go. One of the problems is that our politicians have not been very good at recognising that public expenditure decisions have costs. If you want more tanks, more Trident submarines, more Eurofighters, you're going to have less of something else. And that less of something else is fewer schools, fewer hospitals, and higher taxes. So you have to make sacrifices. And as Friedman said, there are no free lunches. And that I think is one of the problems, that our politicians are not satisfactorily and adequately explaining that there are consequences from decisions to increase public expenditure, be it on health, education, or defence.
Okay, I now think we have done quite a lot on, where you see some of the faults in the UK defence markets lying, and now I'd quite like to try and turn to, to what you see as the positives. So if we've just done everything that's going wrong, I think we can now do the bit where we start to say, well, these are the ways that things can start going right. So firstly, what are you trying to do as a defence economist to help sort out the UK's defence market?
Let me just try to pick my way through it. Governments are central to understanding defence. They are major providers, in some cases, the only providers of defence. And that is a problem in terms of how do we get a competitive market when we only have one buyer? We haven't got competition on the buying side. We can have competition on the supply side. We can have lots of suppliers bidding, competing to provide some sort of defence, whatever it might be. So governments are central to understanding defence and defence economics. But nonetheless, we can introduce some competition, some rivalry into what otherwise appear to be non-competitive type markets. So we could have firms bidding for a defence contract, and governments decide how many firms can bid, or whether firms do bid for defence contracts. So you're right that they're still there, and they are trying to stop markets working. I think people have to be aware that markets are available and can work in defence, even though governments say not. So, for example, we used to have a lot of private finance initiatives, and the government doesn't use them now, but that's a government decision. They could use private finance initiatives whereby the private sector provides services to defence, and in return for which it gets a payment. And so it pays for those services. And the services range from routine things like firing ranges, like accommodation. You can provide accommodation, and that can be provided by private firms who provide it to the governments for a fee, for a rent. We do actually have other examples of private finance initiatives which move towards the front line. For example, air tankers, air refueling tankers. Whilst a private provided, government funds them and pays for them, but it sets up the competition in the first place so that we can get some competition on the supply side. But we've still got the problem of not having competition on the buying side. And my task is to try to think about, expand, explore the opportunities for introducing some competition to markets which traditionally appear non-competitive.
Okay, so from this perspective of wanting to get more competition into the market, what do you see as the ways that that could be done? Because if we think back to the very start of this episode, is we laid out defence markets, we face this issue of there being one buyer, and that's the state. So were we limited now in the ways that we can actually get competition in?
Okay. Well, I have three thoughts on how we can improve things. First of all, we need to get our relationship with Europe sorted out. Europe at the moment is not having the UK as a defence partner, and I think that's a great mistake. There's nothing I can do about it. The Europeans do not seem to want Britain as a partner, but they can't afford to neglect Britain. We are one of the largest defence spenders in Europe, and we're moving to a situation where we need to come together and focus on collective defence, which I think can offer much better value for money. For example, if we had a genuine European market in defence, we would look at anti-missile defence. There would be a possibility for a larger Europe providing anti-ballistic defence. At the moment, we don't, but we could. Where else could we go? We could improve things. I think we could improve by having more reserves, by having a reserve air force, a reserve navy, as well as a reserve army. We've never had, in recent years, a reserve air force and reserve navy. We used to, a long time ago, but other nations do quite well with their reserve air forces. The Israelis have a reserve air force. The Americans have a reserve air force. I think we should have one, and I think we should expand the role of reservists. And then I come back to the incentives facing individuals. We need to actually look at the incentive structure available to individuals in the armed forces and see if we can replicate a system which provides efficiency in private markets, and see if we can convert and translate those efficiency incentives into the military and the armed forces. For example, I think there's much more scope for restoring private finance initiatives and going back to having the private sector providing defence services, and even going up towards the front line. We can speculate about having mercenaries, for example, in the front line. I know it causes eyebrows to raise, but logically it's a possibility. The problem, the objection against it is that as mercenaries, they might always be recontracting and they might move. You can't trust them. But then you can't always trust public provided armies. They mutiny, they desert, and they run away in conflict. So it isn't as though you've got a one-sided argument. There are opportunities for applying market principles in defence, and I think there'll be tremendous savings to be had. I think, for example, the principle of substitution. I would want to explore and expand on that. For example, women replacing men in the armed forces, reserves replacing regulars, helicopters replacing tanks.
So for our listeners, because I was taking notes as you were giving that answer, Professor Hartley, And the big three arguments were if we connect again with Europe to share the costs between partner nations, we can also have multiple states increasing the buyer side competition. And then you mentioned reserve forces to allow the principle of substitution. And all my high school economics classes are now coming back to me in flashes of memory, and I'm not happy about it. But principle of substitution is if you have a cheaper product that you can switch in when the price of your first choice good rises. So essentially the price of the regulars becomes too high. If we have reserves, we can start using the reserves more, make more use of them. It's a lower cost alternative. No, I'll attach some links to relevant economic principles in the description. It'll do a better job than I am at explaining all this. And then finally, the use of PFIs. So public funding to a private company to provide a service. Have you seen any signs that some of the ideas you mention here and that you've advocated for are already coming into play in defence market reforms, specifically UK defence market reforms?
Yeah, there are certain things, and you were starting to move in that direction, where only the state can provide them. The very high risk activities, which might otherwise be horrendously expensive, but still the state has to pay. Because they're expensive, doesn't it? In fact, you won't get anyone else to do them. The state will have to do those activities. No, I was actually more limited. The British, as far as I understand it, MOD has decided not to pursue any more PFIs. Now, I might be wrong on that, but if that's the case, I'm arguing for more PFIs. That they should go back and start the policy again. It's all too easy for the military to argue, oh, the private sector doesn't provide this and won't do these things. There are two things. One, why won't it do them? And it might well be that the military is specifying the contract in such a way as to make it impossible or unattractive to the private sector. It doesn't follow that the private sector is at fault if it's not providing certain activities. It might well be that the set of incentives, I'm back to incentives again, the set of incentives are such that by slightly tweaking them, by slightly rearranging them, or in fact radically rearranging them, the private sector might be willing to enter the market. So I'd like to see more PFI.
On that last point, don't you think that perhaps for all we can say cash is king and people will do nasty jobs for money, that war and the act of war is too bloody for firms to enter that space, and that we already have enough supply-side competition to make these incentives work, to have those improvements in the UK defence market, and actually we don't need to just keep adding more competition all the way to the front line?
Yeah, so I'd like to see more PFIs. Now, as we move towards the front line, that is typically the area where it might be difficult to have the private sector involved. The risks become higher, and it becomes difficult for the private sector or anyone else to write and enforce a contract. Let's think of the Korean War. You can actually have private contractors bidding to provide armed forces in the Korean War, or even any other war. They'll do that, but what we can't anticipate is the whole set of risks involved in some of these military activities. So you contract with South Korea and with the Americans that you'll provide an army to fight in South Korea and to fight the North Koreans over the period 1950 to 53. What you can't anticipate is China coming in, and suddenly you've got to recontract. And that is, I think, the area where the private sector has limitations. Understandably, they don't want to go to war. So I think there are certain activities where it is very difficult, very costly to write and enforce a contract. And you leave it to the state to bear those risks. But of course, the state can't, it's not doing it cheaply. The state has to pay the price of assuming those risks.
Thank you. I'm keeping an eye on the clock here in the studio, and I'm aware that our time for the interview today is coming to an end. So to get us back on a more positive note to end the episode with, Do you think there are parts of the UK system that we can take pride in how they work? I feel we have this kind of the constant sense of it's awful and it's all falling apart when we discuss nearly any field that touches government work. And I know that for defence there's been lots of criticism and doom and gloom about the state of affairs. So what should we look at and say, no, you know what, we can do this and we are doing this and let's have pride in how we're doing it, and we can push that this is the standard we want, that people can take pride in that they do this job well, and that actually let's not be doomerist for the moment.
Yeah, it's that in many ways the procurement system is working quite well. It's an achievement to deliver a highly complex system in a reasonable timescale that works reasonably well. And I come back to the examples. Eurofighter Typhoons, and they're even more complex because they're collaborative projects. They're not just UK government projects. We've got 4 governments involved in providing Eurofighter Typhoons. So it's actually almost a miracle that these things are delivered. And highly complex weapon systems, such as Augustinian weapon systems, are actually created and work. Not perfectly. Some of the highly complex systems always break down. You never get to the front line, but it applies to all modern defence equipment. There are a lot of repairs and maintenance and so on. So I'm not certain I'd be so critical of our existing procurement system. What I would say is that when we have failures, I think we should be more willing to cancel. The problem is, how do you erect budget constraints, which we have in the private sector, and introduce them into the public sector and make them stand and make them effective? There's always a threat there, but the armed forces will turn around and say, well, okay, you don't have defence then. We won't provide. If you cancel this project, you do realise you'll lose this capability. So all I can do is reinforce the need for economic principles.
Professor Hartley, that's unfortunately all we have time for today, but thank you very, very much for joining us. And it's been really interesting to hear what you see as a defence economist, what the problems are within UK procurement, getting perspective which looks around people and incentives and what you could argue is the culture within the system of the UK defence market. I think it will be different for listeners than what they usually hear people talk about as being the faults within UK procurement. Our last episode ended with both speakers talking about resources for people who wanted to get involved within the field that we've talked about today. We weren't able to ask Professor Hartley that today in the interview, but he very kindly sent us in an answer. You will find every link he has for additional reading, additional learning, career advice for anybody who likes the idea of defence economics. It's all in there. That's it for the episode of Resilient State this week. We're going to be back in 2 weeks' time on February the 2nd, and we're going to shift from economic spreadsheets to the skies, as we're joined by David Kirichenko to talk about small drones and the rise of the UAV. You can check out the behind-the-scenes moments and key takeaways from the episode today on our social media. So we're on TikTok and Instagram for posts and reels, and as always, we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Substack and YouTube for the full episodes. Thank you for listening. I will hopefully see you all again for episode 3.